I'm talking about Tracy. She was a 21-year-old woman. She had a 3-year-old son. I went to the police station. They told me she was beat to death with a baseball bat, an iron, and a knife. There was no signs of abuse because she was always covered up. She never went with short sleeves or shorts. She always had pants on. So I never saw any abuse. It was very well hidden. And I don't want any mother to have to go through what I did. It's just too hard. Really too hard. And I feel sorry for the other mothers that did go through this. It's not something you'd want to go through with.
Very few people that were working on domestic violence issues back in the mid-'80s, but we recognized as advocates and officers and the prosecutors that we would get some cases that were coming in. We would have women that would be calling our hotline needing help. We would have people going to a magistrate's office requesting warrants and sometimes being successful with that and sometimes not. At around the same time, the city was looking into how all victims of violence were being treated. And right around that time, in the mid-'80s, City Council developed a Victims of Violence Task Force. And one of the results of that task force, one of the recommendations was that improved services for victims of domestic violence. The city must improve its services for victims of domestic violence. And as a result of the next few years of research and trial and error, eventually one of the biggest recommendations out of that Victims of Violence Crime Task Force and the domestic violence work group that was developed because of it was that there must be a coordinated response to domestic violence in Alexandria, that it's not just an advocate's job or a police officer's job or a prosecutor's job. Everybody must work together in order to have some effect on this problem.
Later, one of the higher ups found a grant that sounded interesting. It was a COPS grant from, I think, Bill Clinton era, and he suggested we apply for it. So I worked on a proposal, and I think Claire helped me with that. And we put a proposal in, and it gave us enough money to get a staff to actually work these cases, and we were able to break out from regular duties and just concentrate on domestic violence cases and the way they hit victims and suspects and family members.
The prosecutor's role in Dvip essentially is to hold the offender accountable. So we take up where the police leave off. So when there's an arrest made, and we've talked about the arrest cases versus the non-arrest cases. When there is an arrest made, the Commonwealth Attorney's Office picks it up and takes it through prosecution until the accounters to hold the offender accountable. And so we work with all of the other agencies. We work with the police department by training the police officers on how to gather evidence. And one of the reasons why we do that is because we understand that victims of domestic violence typically do not want to go through the court system. That's the last thing that they want to do, is go through the system and be cross-examined and be put on a witness stand and asked about the personal details of their lives and how they've been abused. So we try to treat these cases in such a fashion that we can do them what we call victimless, or without having to use the victim as a witness in the prosecution of the case. So the important part of what we do in our legal services and follow up with our victims who need protective orders. A lot of them can't afford legal counsel, so we do direct them to legal services to help them through that civil process to get protective orders once the criminal case is done, or even during the process of the criminal case.
So that increased our workload. And what we're tasked in the probation office with doing is trying to enforce the court's orders for sentencing if they're on probation, to address their needs. So in this situation, it would be addressing probably they would need to go for batter's intervention or some form of counseling if substance abuse is an issue, as well then address their substance abuse needs, and to try and motivate them for change. Because as we've heard, in many of these cases, the the couple's going to stay together, and we need to make sure, as best as we can, that the offender is prepared to carry on that relationship without it ending in violence.
Of multiple cases where my advocate in particular has talked about having reached out initially to a victim who was extremely reluctant, and then years later that victim coming back into the office or calling her in particular and asking for services. And there are multiple incidences where that has occurred, in particular with our domestic violence V-Stop advocate, where a victim has decided well after the fact to leave her abuser and has reached out specifically to that advocate for help.
Well, the big one was when you were able to determine who was the primary aggressor, to arrest that person. In the past, we would just send them out to cool off. So that was a big change. And with that came the documentation for court and reports. So we went from a call where you would just show up and separate people and let them cool down and be gone in 5 or 10 or 15 minutes to taking a couple of hours or longer sometimes.
And since Alexandria had already started a mandatory arrest policy and Virginia was considering that statewide, our domestic violence unit, our sergeant of our domestic violence unit, was very active as well at that level. And eventually in 1996, Virginia passed an omnibus bill on domestic violence, and lo and behold, the whole state now had to go to a mandatory arrest policy. And so we were really groundbreaking and started that, almost 10 years earlier.
I mean, anecdotally, we really have a pretty low recidivism rate in our, we don't take people back to court very much for probation violations where they've been convicted of new abusive behavior.
Well, before this program, we didn't have a lot of statistics, except for we had documented cases where we didn't do anything. So in that respect, the statistics went through the roof. The amount of time on the scene, the amount of reports, the amount of arrests went up a lot, because before we really didn't do anything unless an officer got assaulted, then someone went to jail. But now we had a mandate from the state and the state code to make an arrest. So as the training slowly took effect and as the procedure became accepted more and more, things got more ingrained and became habits in officers. And hopefully today it's a lot better than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and even 5 years ago. But
well, I know going into in the mid and late 80s, it was something like 40% of the homicides in Alexandria were domestic violence related, and as the years went by, that number decreased greatly. And I believe over the last few years, it's been almost 2 or 3 that we've not had a domestic violence homicide. And
when we're here, it's the 25th anniversary of the Domestic Violence Intervention Program, DVIP for short, which was formed in 1988. And we're interviewing you because this is going to be a big anniversary, and you were deeply involved in this, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about domestic violence intervention projects. Tell us about how that
isn't it interesting that we're still talking about it? But the fact is that it's better than it was then. It's not as bad, at least to the naked eye. It's not as bad. I'm sure, as you said earlier in a conversation earlier, that it is very obvious to children who don't always get mentioned in the subject matter of what's being talked about at these things. And so Alexandria had been singled out for a program. And Janet Reno was here, and there was a meeting, a round table with lots of officials, and we talked about the progress thus far.
But you had said, we just spoken, and this is before the camera was on, but you had spoken about some of the history, that this was an issue that really hadn't been focused on. And so here you formed this project. You had a march or a collection of people at Market Square.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about that
Well,
to raise awareness about domestic
yeah.
violence?
That's something that Alexandrians are good at, is getting out and showing the banner. And that's exactly what they were doing, was getting out and showing the banner. And they did such things as put a clothesline up at the Campagna Center, and that registered different things in different people's minds about what was going on for domestic violence. And so this being out in City Hall, in front of City Hall, was exactly the same thing, was just highlighting it. And the people who came out were very, very intense. The people who came out to show the colors were truly deeply involved. It's amazing how much progress there's been. It's hard to keep telling yourself that if you're working on a project, but there has been a lot that's been done, and it's a group of people who want to do something, and they get together and they work at it and do it. And we're fortunate in Alexandria to have a lot of people in officialdom.
I think a proud moment to have been involved in the effort, and happy to work with many individuals who have worked together in every spectrum: police, prosecutors, judges, legislators, the community, city council, and the Office on Women. The fact that the city established the Office on Women and allowed this to happen is an attribute of the city, I think. It's been a really neat thing. I think the legacy of Dvip has a lot to do with the people that are involved in it, including people like Claire Dunn, who've been involved with me and others from the very beginning. So there was a lot of dedication on people that did it, that worked on it. I think the legacy is that it's a continuing effort to be assured that you try to reduce the incidence of domestic violence, repeat offenders, and in large part prevent it by stalking laws and things of that nature. So once someone gets into the system, they can be monitored so they don't become involved as repeat offenders. So I think it's a continuing effort, and it will remain a continuing effort because of the people involved in it.